She literally believes whatever this thing is the devil. And she apparently got a vicar around to start spraying holy water everywhere, to try and, I guess, exorcise the house, I guess, to try and get rid of whatever it was. And then apparently the vicar came along and then, sprayed a bunch of the holy water on her as well. Because as I said, like, Shirley seems to be at the sort of the center of this. Don't forget that the key, that ornate key that she mentioned at the beginning, was found on her pillow. Hello guys, I'm Zahir and I'm going to be talking about Britain's most famous ghost story. This is the Battersea Poltergeist. If you haven't heard this one before, guys, strap yourselves in. Major stories for the Battersea Poltergeist story if you haven't heard it already. Let's get into it. So our story begins in 1956 on 63 Wycliffe Road. This is in Battersea. This is a place in London. Now, back then it would have been quite a working class community. Of course, if you were to see Battersea right now, it looks very different, especially after all that gentrification. If you look at the Battersea Power Station today, it's got a bunch of swanky bars and sports shops and cafes and the rest of it, places to eat. But it didn't look like that back then. Back then it was a very working class community, and the Hitchings family is made up of a few different people. So we have Walter, he's known as Wally Hitchings, he's the father of the family. You've got his wife, that's Kitty. So Kitty is, she's in a wheelchair so I think she's got some sort of health problems. So, she's disabled. You've got the adoptive brother, so the adoptive son in the family, who is Jonathan. And then you've also got essentially the kind of protagonist of this story, who is Shirley Hitchings, that this story is really going to be focusing on. Last but not least, you've got Ethel. So Ethel is Wally's mother. Wally, of course, being Shirley's dad. So let's get started. So our story begins in 1956, and you have to kind of imagine what it would be like back then. So, we're talking about 11 years after the war, so this is post-war Britain. So Shirley comes home one day and she finds a key on her pillow. She finds this key, and the key is about 4 inches long. She says it was quite ornate. It's got kind of like curly bits on it. It looks a bit fancy. So they find this key, and she doesn't know where it's come from. Nobody has seen this kind of key before in the house. And then she goes around the house, trying different locks, trying different, cupboards or what have you, doors, whatever it is, to see if the key fits and to see what it opens. And it doesn't open anything. They don't know where this thing came from or what it's even for. So eventually I think they just end up leaving it on the mantelpiece. I guess, it looks kind of nice, so why not display it to everyone? Now, the key is really, like, this is just the beginning of this story, of this strange story. But the key itself is just a prelude to what is going to happen next. That night, while the Hitchings family are trying to sleep, all of a sudden they hear very loud banging in the house. And it seems to be coming from downstairs, it seems to be coming from upstairs, they're hearing it everywhere. And the worst thing is they can't figure out where it's coming from. And apparently it's woken everyone up at like 3 o'clock in the morning. Just imagine you're asleep and then all of a sudden you just hear all of this banging. And just to kind of bring home just how bizarre this is so loud that the neighbors are coming out and then knocking on their door and saying, "What the hell are you guys doing at 3 a.m. banging so loudly?" And I think about that. I'm thinking, what would it even be able to create a noise that loud? You'd get a hammer or a mallet and then bang on something metal repeatedly over and over again. And the issue is that it seems to be coming from within the house, but they can't figure out where. And they go from top to bottom and there's nothing. They just can't figure it out. Even creepier, there's also a kind of scratching that's going on from within the house as well. I should have prefaced this by saying, like, I'm not really a believer. I'm not really a guy who's into the supernatural or too much of a believer in ghosts and all that kind of stuff. But I know enough people in my own life that have said that they've had their own experiences, whatever they may be, that that it intrigues me, that this topic intrigues me. And you're going to see just where this story goes, because things are about to get quite crazy. This is just the beginning. So the loud banging goes on all night, and of course the neighbors are not particularly very happy about this, and neither are the Hitchings family, because nobody's gotten any sleep. So I don't think that the banging goes on beyond that night, as far as I can tell. But what does happen is that they start hearing this, rather than banging, loud banging that's disturbing all of the neighbors, it's replaced with a kind of knocking. They start hearing this knocking in different places around the house. And it's also going on, at night when these guys are trying to sleep. And this, I should mention, this goes on for weeks. For weeks, they're not able to sleep. And you can imagine what that does to the human mind, to the human psyche. You eventually you're going to crack. Like, one night of bad sleep for me, too, and I'm in a very bad place. I'm very grouchy, I'm very grumpy, and this starts to take its toll on the family. Now, as I mentioned, the person who's at the center of this story is Shirley. I should mention that Shirley was quite young at this time. She was only 15 years old in 1956, and she was interviewed for this Battersea Poltergeist podcast on BBC Sounds app at the tender age of 80, just a couple of years ago when that podcast came out. And that podcast kind of opens with the journalist getting a box of evidence from a man known as Harold Chibbett. Now, he's quite an interesting character in and of himself, but he's known as Chib for short. And he was essentially a kind of paranormal investigator by night. By day, he was a tax inspector. This is a guy who was a World War I pilot. So I think he was in his 50s at the time, and he'd heard about this case and he'd investigated it. And so the journalist in this podcast is now looking through this box of Harold Chibbett's evidence. So this banging that I mentioned, I mean the one that the neighbors heard, this started at the end of January 1956, and apparently it was going on for days at a time, and nobody's been able to find the source of this. As I said, the family went up and down the house and they couldn't find what it was. And then what happens is, a couple of weeks in, things apparently start flying around the house. Pots and pans, though I think it begins at first with one of Shirley's gloves ends up hitting somebody, one of the family members, I forget who now, in the face. And of course, everyone's just getting a little bit annoyed, everyone's getting a little bit antsy, as you would be if things apparently begin flying around the house. Now, at one point, Shirley says that now heavy pots and pans, a couple of weeks later, so we're now talking about February 18th. Heavy pots and pans are now flying around the kitchen. She says that, it would, a pot or a pan might fly towards you, stop in front of you, and then fall to the ground. In some cases might, fly towards you, and you'd have to dodge it, because if you don't dodge it, it's going to hit you, in which case it ends up hitting the wall instead. Now, of course, this is a fantastical story. If anyone told you this story, you'd think, none of this makes any sense. How are pots and pans and gloves and Lord knows what else going around, hitting people in the face, or you're having to dodge them, or whatever? The thing about this case in particular is that it's easy to kind of try and isolate this to the Hitchings family itself. You'd be forgiven for thinking, who's saying this? It's all a bunch of people in the same family who's making up a bunch of stuff, right? Hold that thought, because as we go forward, you're going to find that there are people who are not in the family, that don't have any interest in this story, that end up corroborating a bunch of stuff that just doesn't make any sense. Now, as I said, I'm not really a believer in the supernatural. I've never had any sort of, strange things that have happened to me that I can't explain. Perhaps I'm fortunate in that respect. But there are things that go on in this story that I can't explain. I just can't explain. If you would ask me, well, how is that possible? And given now that we have, a number of different corroborating accounts, how do you explain that here? I'd just say, well, I don't really know. I feel like if I end up going down the question of, well, did this really happen? Did this really happen? I feel like it just ends up opening more questions. So Shirley, when she's interviewed, a couple of years ago for this podcast, ends up saying, not only are these pots and pans flying around the room, and you're dodging them. She said that her dad's slippers, that's Wally, his slippers would be walking around the room. They would float off the ground and then they would walk around the room and then sort of like go upstairs, and she would end up following them. Like, bizarre, just absolutely bizarre. Now, I should mention that Chib, that's Harold Chibbett, the tax inspector and former World War I pilot, but also paranormal investigator, at some point heard about this case because, people were talking about it. There's local gossip, but it's also somehow found its way into, I think, the local press as well, since some people are now mentioning it. And so Chib ends up getting involved and ends up coming to the house. And as you can imagine, I think at first the family are probably a little bit skeptical. Who is this guy? What does he want? Why is he here? But he's just really interested in the paranormal, and he's going to end up chasing this story down. So he speaks to them. So Chib, apparently, when the pots and the pans were flying around and the slippers were, walking around by themselves, he was apparently always either out at the pub or he was at work when all of these things were going on. So, what does it say that the guy who's really interested in this and is not involved in the family, what does it say that he's not at home when these things are going on? I don't know. I think it's easy to be skeptical about that and say, well, it didn't happen when he was around because, it was something that the family made up. But we'll get to that. So I mentioned at the beginning of this that Shirley has a adoptive brother called Jonathan. And apparently at some point in the house, he's downstairs and he hears a scream. So he goes upstairs to find out what the hell's going on. And he sees Shirley in bed, and some unknown thing, seems to be trying to pull the bed sheets off. And she apparently is levitating something like 6 inches off the bed, and her back is arched. And when I first heard about this, I just thought that sounds absolutely terrifying. A 15-year-old girl, your sister in this case, back arched, and something is pulling off the bed sheets and is levitating her. That would scare the bejesus out of anyone. So all of these bizarre things are happening in this story, and at some point, the family is still in the house, and they have to kind of get used to this. And so this entity or this thing, whatever it is that is, making the slippers walk around and throwing pots and pans, and who did the very loud banging at the beginning or what have you, they end up giving it or him a name. They call him Donald. And so going forward, the poltergeist in the house is known as Donald. So Chib ends up having a conversation with Shirley herself, and apparently says something like, quite often it is a young girl. It's a girl that sort of attracts these sort of entities, these poltergeists or what have you. And this was quite similar to the Enfield poltergeist story, which I might do a separate video on if there's enough interest in that. But the Enfield poltergeist story, the only thing that I remember, because I first heard about it when I was in school, there was a documentary on the BBC, and all I remember was that there was somebody who was apparently walking by the house and that could see one of the girls in this Enfield poltergeist story was like flying around the room or was like moving up or down, and this was not somebody who was in the family that was making this statement. And that was something about that particular case that caught my eye. But I am reminded of that in this Battersea poltergeist story. So Shirley, when she's being interviewed at 80, is saying like, this terrified me. Like, why is it me? Why is this thing, whatever it is, interested in me? Have I attracted it? Have I done something wrong? Am I doing something wrong? She said that there was a lot of crying and fear, and she was frightened, as was the entire family, because not nobody really knows what to do about this. I'm thinking about Wally, Shirley's dad, as her father. And keep in mind it's the 1950s. He's the man of the house. It's kind of his responsibility to look after the household, to look after his daughter and the others in the house. And going back to that story about Jonathan, Shirley's adoptive brother, when he found her apparently levitating above the bed, her body was stiff, and he had to kind of pull her down. Anyone would be freaked out by something like that. So, as I said, at some point in the story, quite early on, there's local gossip, but there's also local media reports as well. And after a certain bit of time, it now starts hitting the sort of the wider press, not just the local press. So, journalists are now knocking on their door, right? So inside the house, they've apparently got this entity which is knocking and moving stuff around, levitating people, and now they can't go outside the house because the press are now hounding them. Shirley says that she'd asked her mum if she could go see her friend who lived literally a couple of doors down, and her mum was like, "Yeah, it's fine." And she says that once she stepped out of the door, a bunch of journalists started trying to speak to her and trying to talk to her about this ghost, and they were kind of hounding her a bit, and she just she was so frightened by this whole thing, by all of the attention, that she ended up turning around and then running back inside. So she couldn't even go 2 doors down to her friend's place. That's how big this story was now becoming. And you can imagine a 15-year-old girl, and apparently it was a bunch of men, and she's afraid, and they're snapping photos of her as well. So they're trying to get their story camped outside this family's house. Now, at some point, apparently, Shirley ends up working out a way to communicate with this thing in the house, with Donald. They figured out, one knock is no, and 2 is yes. So they start trying to communicate with this thing, whatever it is, and start asking it questions. Now, I'll come back to the having a conversation with Donald through knocks in just a minute. I just wanted to mention about Ethel. So Ethel was Wally's mother, Wally being Shirley's dad, and she was apparently a very big woman. She was apparently like 6'4", and when she did, eventually pass, they needed to get a specially made coffin for her because she was that big. But this was a woman who apparently, lived through the Blitz and was quite fiery and was quite sort of not afraid of too many things. I guess if you've been through, if you've lived through World War II and you've seen the kind of stuff that happened there, then it's probably the case that you're not gonna be afraid of very much. But she was apparently like quite a fiery, very religious, I think very Catholic Irish woman. And Ethel, I think, scared Shirley a little bit, because when Ethel is talking about Donald, and she has shall we say, an antagonistic relationship with Donald, she literally thinks that Donald is the devil. Not some representative of the devil or some minion of the devil. She literally thinks he's the devil, and she's a very religious woman. So anyway, journalists start showing up at the house, and I think that they decide to invite some in, and one of them is somebody from the Daily Mail, and that person asks Donald, "Are you in love with Shirley?" And Donald replies with 2 knocks. There's a second journalist by the name of Joyce Lewis, and we'll come back to her because there's a bit more about her in this story. She's from the South London Advertiser, which I think does not exist anymore. But she ends up asking, "Are you evil?" You get a single knock. So Donald, apparently this entity that's banging and haranguing and harassing this family, is not evil. So he's saying himself. And then, they end up asking, or she ends up asking Donald how old Shirley is. And Donald apparently knocks 15 times. So, ends up answering that question as well. And there's one final question, which is, Donald, are you going to go away? Are you going to leave us alone? Are you going to let us sleep at night so we don't need to worry about this? And Donald apparently replies, which was, no, no, no. So pretty scary at this point. I mean, this Donald thing, whatever it is, could be quite dangerous. If you get hit in the head with a saucepan, I'd imagine that would hurt quite a lot. So after the meeting with those two journalists, of course, stories end up coming out, and the stories they're not particularly great, I'd imagine, for Shirley and the family. Apparently they're talking about, Shirley's ghost boyfriend, how the ghost has fallen in love with her because, apparently, Donald did answer with 2 knocks when asked, are you in love with Shirley? Because of course they were trying to figure out, well, what is it about this girl that Donald likes? Now, Shirley at this time, of course, she's a teenager, she's a child, and she says that at the time she would say to her dad, make it stop, Dad. You can imagine the helplessness of Wally in this. As I said, he's the man of the house, he's got a daughter, and your daughter's saying, make it stop, Dad. And he can't, and I'm guessing it's not just the whole poltergeist thing, it's not just Donald. It's also the stuff that's going on outside now. There's all of this sort of attention, this unwanted attention. Apparently, people, couldn't leave the house. She would say that Jonathan, her adopted brother, might be able to sneak out for work from time to time. She says that, well, her nan, that's Ethel, her grandmother, isn't going out. Nobody's really leaving the house now. So they're stuck inside with whatever this thing is that is harassing them, that is causing them trouble. They can't leave the house. They can't even go anywhere either. And as if it wasn't bad enough, by the way, Wally, who's a train driver, I think he was a train driver for the London Underground, which would be, I guess you would call it the Metro in the US. But he couldn't drive his train on the tube because of the attention, obviously, from the journalists, from the press, but also because at home nobody's really sleeping. Nobody's sleeping. Do you want a sleep-deprived guy driving a train on the London Underground? Probably not. And I think at this point in the story, he's been signed off with half pay. An interesting thing happens at this point. So as I mentioned, Ethel, that's Shirley's grandmother, she literally believes whatever this thing is the devil. And she apparently got a vicar around to start spraying holy water everywhere. To try and, I guess, exorcise the house, I guess, to try and get rid of whatever it was. And then apparently the vicar came along and then, sprayed a bunch of the holy water on her as well. Because as I said, like, Shirley seems to be at the sort of the center of this. Don't forget that the key, that ornate key that she mentioned at the beginning was found on her pillow. Donald apparently, according to those 2 knocks, is in love with her. And of course, Shirley doesn't. She says that she doesn't want any of this. She doesn't want any of this attention. She doesn't want any of this attention from the press. She doesn't want any of this attention from Donald either. So of course, Ethel, Shirley's grandmother, really doesn't like whatever this thing is. She's the one that got the vicar, and apparently after this whole thing with the vicar spraying the holy water everywhere, like, Donald's, at his worst, like, he's very, very pissed off, and, things start flying around all over again. Apparently, Ethel had a sort of a 12 to 15 inch crucifix, so like a very big crucifix, and this thing was, brought downstairs by her. She put it on the floor, so that it could be with the family, I guess. And Shirley says that, this thing went flying across the room like somebody had kicked it like a football. And Shirley's dad, Wally, says something like, look what you've done, Ma. Look what you've done, as in, you've pissed this thing off. Now, a weird thing happens at this point in the story. So Wally has a colleague at work. I don't know how well acquainted they are. I don't know how much of a relationship they have before this. But Harry ends up speaking to Wally. This is Harry Hanks. Now, the thing that Wally didn't know about Harry Hanks at this point is that Harry Hanks is a spiritualist. Spiritualism apparently is some type of Christianity that started, I think, early that century. So early last century it started. And so he's kind of into things like seances and trying to contact the dead and all the rest of it. And, you know, just kind of put yourself in the family's position, assuming all of this happened and assuming all this is real and all this, went on. You're not sleeping. You're getting the press attention. You can't protect your daughter, and she's saying, "Dad, make it stop." And this guy comes along. I mean, he's a colleague at least, so you sort of know him, and he's saying, "Hey, I can help you. I can help you. Like invite me around, and we'll see what we can do." And so Harry Hanks now gets involved in the case of the Battersea Poltergeist. So Wally ends up mentioning his newfound friend Harry Hanks to the rest of the family, and ends up asking Shirley and I think Chib as well to go with him to see Harry. Now, Harry wants to do a spiritual exorcism. And so, so Wally and Shirley end up being invited to this house where there's a seance going on. Now, if you don't know, like a seance is essentially a bunch of people sit around a table and then they try to contact the dead. This is what the spiritualists are about. And there's a very interesting aspect to this story, by the way, and we'll get to it. But Wally and Chib and Shirley end up going to Harry's place, and Shirley says, well, there were a bunch of people sat on chairs in a circle. Shirley says it was a Friday night, and there's a fireplace, there's a fire going, and the lights are kind of turned down low, so it's a little bit dim during this seance. Shirley says, I didn't like this. I didn't like it. I didn't like that I'd been brought to this place. It was a little bit scary. And she apparently says to her dad, I don't want this, Dad. I don't want to be here. I don't want to do this. Because they hadn't mentioned to Shirley herself that they're going to do an exorcism on Shirley. And her dad, of course, as I said, like, you have to look at it from his perspective. He's apparently quite desperate at this point, so he'll take whatever help he can get. And he tries to reassure his daughter. He says, well, don't worry, things will be fine. It'll be all right. Just like continue on, basically. And so Harry Hanks is sat in a chair, and apparently he's kind of, his demeanor changes. He closes his eyes and he starts making crazy facial expressions, and he's kind of writhing around in his chair, contacting Donald, and says something like, he is with me and I can see him, and he wants the girl for himself, but we won't let him have her, and we will tell him to go. So you can imagine being a 15-year-old girl at this point. Like, this is going to be quite creepy. It's going to be quite freaky. You've been brought to this exorcism. You're the target of the exorcism, and nobody had told you up until this point, now that you're sort of in the middle of it. Shirley says at this point the lights were sort of going up and down. I mean, this sounds very much like sort of a typical horror story, sort of ghost story, that the lights are going up and down. And she says while this is going on and she's terrified, and Harry Hanks is kind of talking about Donald and writhing in his chair and all the rest of it, there's a knock at the door, and Mrs. Hanks, Harry Hanks' wife, ends up going down the stairs to try and answer the door. And Shirley can hear downstairs that there's some sort of commotion, there's some sort of conversation going on, an argument or something is happening. And then she hears some people coming up, and then they enter the room, and it's the police. And the police have said something like, Harry Hanks, we have had reports of black magic, and that you are in the process of summoning the devil. Now, here's the crazy part of this story, if I remember correctly, summoning the devil was illegal in Britain at the time. Said it's the 1950s, and the press or somebody had tipped off the police that there was something going on. Summoning the devil is a little bit different to a seance or an exorcism, but I guess whoever made the report or the police themselves are not particularly interested in the differences between these things. Now, I should mention that after this whole thing where the police end up intruding upon the exorcism of Shirley, Harry Hanks ended up going to his Member of Parliament, who was the MP for Brixton, and he ended up asking a question to Parliament, and I think we ended up getting a response, which I'm going to read right now. And so the Home Secretary, this is a Major William Lloyd George, replied, "Normally the reasons for police action in the course of their duty are not given, but in the circumstances of this case I am willing to state that I am informed by the Commissioner of Police that on the evening of 22nd of February the police received information purporting to come from this address about a black magic circle proposed to be held there that evening. As the practice of black magic is an offence at common law, the police called to inquire whether there were any grounds for police action." So this went so far as to get a response from the Home Secretary himself. Now, if you're not British, then you may not know that sort of the great officers of state, are like the Prime Minister, and then you've got the Chancellor of the Exchequer, who's basically the head of the Treasury. He controls the money, and then you've got and then it's the Foreign Secretary, and then you get the Home Secretary. The Home Secretary runs things at home. And this is one of the reasons that this case is so well known, that it ended up having to be addressed by not just a Member of Parliament, but also by the Home Secretary himself. So Shirley's dad has to apparently reassure the police and say that, well, no, nothing untoward was going on. There's no black magic going on. I don't know, does a seance or an exorcism count as black magic? I'm not sure. But apparently everyone gave a statement that night. And of course, it ended up with the Home Secretary giving this statement as well. And, the press themselves ended up having a bunch of headlines about black magic going on. And so, as you can imagine, this story is kind of snowballing. It's quite well known. Everyone across the country is now learning about it. So Shirley apparently comes back home, with her dad, and the press are still outside, but the house itself at least is quiet. And this is one of the few times that they end up with a reprieve from Donald, who has been, torturing this family for however long at this point in the story. So I think not long after this, I don't know if it's the day after or in the days after that, but, don't forget that this story is hot in the press. There's all of this stuff about the black magic and the seance and the exorcism and the rest of it. And so what ends up happening is that a journalist ends up knocking on the door of the Hitchings family home. And he shows up, and Shirley says, he was a little man, and he had his hair combed down, and he had a camera around his neck. She said that he swaggered a bit, but, I didn't really like him particularly much. But they showed up, and he ended up saying, hey, we've got a chauffeur-driven car outside, come to Fleet Street, and, let's have a conversation. Now, Fleet Street, for those of you not in the UK, Fleet Street is where all the traditional sort of newspapers would have been. The major newspapers in the UK would all have been there. So Fleet Street is a byword for the press here in Britain. So the man at the door with the camera around his neck was John Knight, who was from the Daily Mail. And so Shirley ends up getting in the car and ends up going to their Fleet Street offices to be interviewed. And so she gets there, and there's another man there by the name of Ronald Maxwell, and Shirley mentions that she's kind of uncomfortable. She doesn't necessarily want to be there, but I'm just kind of wondering, just thinking about it now. I don't know how it is that she ended up going by herself. Were none of her parents there, or her brother, or anyone like that? So I don't even know. It isn't mentioned exactly how she ended up in car, and was Shirley the one who opened the door? I don't really know, but she ends up in the car, she ends up in the offices, she ends up going with John Knight and speaking to this Maxwell guy, and she says that they bought in a can of Tizer. If you're not in the UK, then you won't know what a Tizer is. A Tizer is a type of soft drink, a kind of fizzy drink. I think it's Scottish. It's kind of an orangey color. And so she is there. They bring in the Tizer and they bring in a bowl of sweets. You might say candy in the US. So Shirley says at this point, they kind of been quite nice to her, but they're also asking her a bunch of pointed questions about the tapping, and they're also taking photos of her as well. And keep in mind that Shirley at this point is 16 years old, so she's just turned 16, and they're asking her these questions. And I don't know if it's Maxwell or if it's John Knight, but one of them says something like, "Well, look, those are some big boots you've got there. Can you take them off?" And I think at some point they ask her to like hold this big shoe or boot next to her face, and then they snap a couple more photos. Now, she's mentioned, as I said, she's a bit uncomfortable. She doesn't necessarily want to be there. She wants to go home. She's feeling a bit uncomfortable. Who are these two guys? And she's a 16-year-old girl. So she says that Maxwell and John Knight end up having a sort of a private word, a very quiet word. I think one of them ends up leaving the room, and one of them ends up saying, "Well, hey, have a conversation with your brother." Have a conversation with your brother and see what he says. And so she gets on a call and she speaks to Jonathan. And Jonathan apparently says something along the lines of, "Oh, don't worry about those men, it'll be fine, things will be okay. Just be a good girl and do what they say." So Shirley ends up doing what they say. They end up asking her to, put your shoes and your socks back on after they've taken this photo of her with her shoe by her head, and then they end up taking her to a Harley Street doctor. Now, another thing for those of you who are not in Britain, Harley Street is a part of London that is very well known for sort of, essentially the best kind of private doctors that you can buy. So, if you've got the money and you can pay for it, then you can go and find a Harley Street doctor to diagnose whatever problems you might be having. So Harley Street is a byword for top-notch doctors, top-notch private doctors here in the UK. So Shirley is taken to see this Harley Street doctor, and I failed to mention that throughout the time that Shirley was in these Fleet Street Daily Mail offices, the tapping has continued. So you can still hear the tapping even though they're no longer in the house. And the tapping is even apparently continuing once she ends up in the office of this Harley Street doctor. And there's a point that Shirley says, well, the curtains blew out. They kind of billowed out, something like a strong gust of wind, and then all of the stuff that was on the table on the desk of the doctor ended up kind of flying up into the air and then falling down. And the doctor apparently freaks and ends up running out of the room and leaves the door open. This is what Shirley says. So Ronald Maxwell ends up coming into the room once his doctor runs out, and Shirley says, "I want to go home." And so they end up taking her home. And Shirley says that once she got home, she spoke to Jonathan, her brother, and she says, "Well, you told me to speak to them. You told me, be a good girl and speak to them. Don't worry, everything's fine." And Jonathan apparently says, "I didn't speak to you. I was at work." So the implication here being that, well, those journalists ended up faking, getting somebody to call, pretending to be Jonathan, and then telling Shirley not to be afraid. I mean, there's also a question of like, well, would Shirley really not be able to recognize her own brother on the phone? Is that even possible? But this is the story that she's telling. Now, not long after this, a story ends up being published from the Daily Mail about the Hitchings family, about about Shirley herself, and apparently they've got the photo of her holding her shoe up to her face. And this kind of discredits the family a little bit. It ends up, that they don't look so good, because out of this comes what's known as the hammer toe theory. So the hammer toe theory is the idea that, well, all of the tapping is caused by Shirley herself. That she's, I don't know, cracking joints or something. It's not clear to me what, but she's doing this with her toes. I think there's something about Shirley might have done some ballet at some point, but she's making the noises from her feet, and that's the reason that they made her take off her shoes and socks and held up the shoe by her face while they take photos. And apparently, like, there's precedent for this. There's something like, the Fox sisters in the US. I think they were in New York, and so this is some time before. I don't know, I think in the 1800s in the US, something like that. And the Fox sisters are well known for actually starting spiritualism, which was the religion that Harry Hanks, the medium, the guy doing the exorcism, practiced. And there's a whole story about how they used to be able to contact the dead or something like that, and that they used to be able to do these taps, these knocks, and nobody could figure out where they were from. And then at some point they end up confessing. I think they ended up recanting the confession later on, but they end up confessing in front of like 2,500 people that, well, actually, hey, look, I'm making this knocking sound with my toe. I don't even know how you do that, but yeah, apparently there is precedent for it. It is something that happened, and so it was also something that I guess Ronald Maxwell and Jonathan Knight were trying to sort of attribute the whole Donald phenomenon, at least the tapping, to Shirley herself. She's just cracking her joints or something like that. Now, at this point in the story, there's kind of an escalation in what's going on. Up to this point, there's been a great deal of mental anguish, but things are about to get quite dangerous now. There's a fire in the house. I think some tea towels were left on the hob, on the stove, and there's a little fire. There's a panic, of course, and at some point it's quickly put out, so I don't think anyone is really hurt. But that's just the first fire. There's a second fire after this that ends up doing a bit more damage. So I think this one ends up happening during the day, and it's Wally's bed that ends up catching on fire, and Wally himself is actually hurt. He ends up in the hospital for this. So the fire did happen. There are newspaper accounts at the time saying that it did happen, and apparently it was completely spontaneous. There isn't a known cause of what happened with that fire. The Daily Express at the time apparently reported that they couldn't find what the cause of the fire was. There's a statement from the police in the South London Advertiser, which is not quite a complete quote, but it's about as close as I'm going to be able to get, and I'm just going to read that. So the police say, the official verdict on our investigation is result negative. There is not the least bit of suspicion that the fire was deliberately started by someone in the house. We don't believe in poltergeist, but we must admit that there is some freak of nature there. Something out of the ordinary is going on in Wycliffe Road. Now, anyway, Shirley says, I remember the fire brigade coming in, taking Dad away and putting the fire out. The bed was ruined. Then they called for an ambulance and they took him to the local Battersea General Hospital. Even more weird at this point is that there are apparently gouge marks on Wally. So where he has been burned, there are scratch marks, gouge marks, something like that. I think Shirley likens it to like claws, something like that. Something attacked him. So it tried to burn him and then also scratch him at the same time. And as with all of this stuff, my sort of skeptical brain is like, well, there's a number of ways that this could have happened and a number of ways that it could be explained. And, does it also require people to be a little bit dishonest as well? The facts of the cases and the stuff that we actually know for sure, the fire brigade and the police all saying basically, we don't know what happened. We couldn't tell you what the cause of the fire is. There isn't any suspicion that it's somebody in the house that did it. This is another one of those things where I'm like, well, I don't know how to explain that. I don't know how to explain that. It's just, something happened, as the police and the fire brigade said, something happened, but there is no explanation for what happened. And of course, Shirley and the Hitchings family would say, well, it's Donald. It's a poltergeist. The question really is, what do you believe? What do you think? At this point, guys, I think I'm going to end this video because this is getting quite long and I'm running out of light to finish this video. So I'm going to leave it at this. Thank you for getting to the end of this video. Please like, share, subscribe, all of those things, because I'd like to continue making this kind of content, and I do want to make a part 2. So I am going to end up continuing this story. So if you liked this, let me know. Pop something in the comments. Are you a believer? Are you a non-believer? What do you think? Have you heard of the Battersea Poltergeist story? If you haven't, fantastic, great. Let me know what you think. Pop us a comment, and I will see you next time for the next video. Thank you very much. Have a good day.